Don't say Olympus, don't say Olympus. Breaking news, the Olympus OM-1 has leaked. We have all the details for you here, and we're gonna answer the question of whether Micro Four Thirds is really dead, or maybe they're back. But first, a word from our sponsor, Squarespace. No matter what type of website you need, Squarespace is the perfect place to start. Head to squarespace.com/Tony. Set up a website completely free. Set up your own store to sell prints, take appointments from clients. Whatever you can imagine, you can make it happen in just a few minutes at Squarespace. And you probably won't run into any problems. It's incredibly easy. But if you do, they have 24/7 technical support, incredible analytics, mobile apps. Anyway, check it out now. Once again, squarespace.com/Tony. And if you love it, use the coupon code Tony, and that'll get you 10% off after your free trial. Thanks, Squarespace. And thanks to every rumor sites that's covering this. I think NikonRumors.com actually leaked the actual spec sheet, but I've also seen PhotoRumors.com, MirrorlessRumors.com, and of course 43Rumors.com, all covering this information, so I'm not sure where it's actually sourced. First of all, Olympus has been, I keep saying Olympus. This is now the company JIP. Olympus exited the camera industry completely, sold off that business to a company called JIP, and as part of that transfer, they were able to let go a lot of employees, shut down factories, cut out a lot of debt that Olympus had been carrying to hopefully make the camera business profitable once again. Part of this is sort of how Japanese businesses work. They can't simply do massive layoffs like they can in America, and instead it's easier for them to actually transfer it to another company to continue something on. OM Systems, which is what I should be calling the company, has given us several teasers on what this camera will look like, and it looks like it's going to look a lot like the other cameras in the EM1 series, which makes sense. Camera manufacturers don't tend to redesign their cameras. I think looking closely, you can see some of the buttons have changed a little bit, but otherwise, you could pretty much guess that it's going to feel the same as the EM1 in your hands. That camera always felt great, so no problem with that. Let's talk about the sensor now. This is something that people are really disappointed about, but it continues to have a 20 megapixel sensor. People for a long time have really wanted to get a higher megapixel sensor in one of these Micro Four Thirds cameras. After all, if they have smartphones with literally 100 megapixel sensors, then why can't they put something higher in a Micro Four Thirds camera? They could, they just have not. Those sensors are even available, like Sony sells them, but nobody has actually managed to use them and address that demand. That's really disappointing, especially because Olympus in particular has a huge audience of wildlife photographers who really appreciate that extra pixel density for the sort of inevitable cropping that you have to do with big prime lenses. OM Systems is advertising 7 stops of sensor stabilization, and indeed this is pretty consistent with what we found testing their earlier cameras. That sensor stabilization is pretty amazing, probably better than what you see out of systems like Nikon, Sony, and Fuji. And that extra stabilization helps close the gap between the smaller Micro Four Thirds sensor and the bigger sensors in those systems. After all, if you can hand hold for 2 stops longer in low light, then this Micro Four Thirds camera would produce full frame equivalent images as far as like noise amounts go. Having a bigger sensor isn't always the best way to get better image quality. You see, a little savvy can help too. Another way that Olympus helps improve image quality is with their high-res mode, which is very similar to what Sony has with their pixel shift technology, where the sensor will move half a pixel in each direction, thus producing an 80 megapixel image out of that 20 megapixel sensor. Besides capturing more detail, it also drastically reduces noise by the simple act of stacking those images. It also eliminates things like moire and a lack of color detail. So you'll see a great deal more sharpness in areas of primary colors, especially red and blue, because it eliminates the negative effects of the red, blue, green Bayer filter, providing full color information for every single pixel. And it does work in very limited conditions. You need to have a heavy tripod, a still subject, and in fact, the only time we've been able to reliably produce images using this mode in any camera is right here in our basement studios with nobody else walking around the house. Like if the laundry machine is going upstairs, it'll ruin the shot. If a truck drives by in the street outside, it'll ruin the shot. And as a result, I don't consider this to be a benefit for landscape photographers, but maybe if you're doing fine art reproductions or commercial photography in a controlled environment, you can use it to produce fantastic images. What I do find to be useful, especially when we tested the EM1X, is the handheld high-res mode. And this is simply capturing multiple sequential images and then stacking them together. This is exactly what just about every modern smartphone does to produce those amazing low-light images. It's just computational photography. But when we tested in the EM1X, it actually worked. And that meant in low light, handheld, that Micro Four Thirds EM1X produced better quality images than full-frame cameras for real. Some of you do not embrace computational photography, but I, for one, welcome our new computational photography overlords. And the fact is, Olympus is a leader when it comes to this technology. And I'm excited to see if Olympus has made OM systems. I'm excited to see if OM systems have made any improvements over our tests on the EM1X. I also want to point out the benefit of the squarer aspect ratio that Micro Four Thirds uses compared to your common APS-C and full-frame cameras. See, the 4/3 is the actual ratio, whereas full-frame cameras tend to have a 3:2 aspect ratio. Most of us today are sharing images in square aspect ratios. Things like Instagram are 4:5, which is closer to 4:3 than 3:2. When you factor in the extra cropping necessary from a full-frame aspect ratio, it means you get about 10% more pixels on Micro Four Thirds. 43rumors.com is reporting that the sensor will be quad bare. That means that every single pixel will have a full red, blue, green pixel arrangement inside of it. This type of sensor has become very common in smartphones, but rumors have even said that the A7S Mark III from Sony has a quad bare sensor. Here's the part I don't believe. They're saying that this will provide a two-stop benefit in low light. And that makes no sense because I have tested several different quad bare sensors and there's no low light benefit. There's no low light detriment. It's a draw because every sensor seems to have run up against the limitations of physics and the bare filter arrangement. And thus we have not seen any low light improvement from the actual physical sensor in maybe 5 years or so. This two-stop improvement, maybe it comes from the image stacking that we were talking about. Maybe they cranked up the noise reduction at high ISOs. Or maybe it's just pure marketing BS. Or maybe there's a miracle waiting to happen. They're using a Sony sensor. It seems unlikely that Sony would give them some new breakthrough tech that somehow improved low light performance by 4 times. That's what two stops is. Subscribe to see the full review when we answer questions like that. Let's talk about the video specs. It seems like this new sensor has a higher readout speed, and OM Systems has rearranged the camera to take advantage of that. That means that the readout speed for 4K video has doubled from 4K 30 in the EM1 Mark III to 4K 60, and it's doing that at 10-bit 422. That basically just means you have more gradients. So if you're doing heavy color grading, you won't see as many artifacts. The specs say it'll do full HD, that's 1080p, in RAW DCI, that's the wider aspect ratio, or it'll do full HD at 240 frames per second with compressed H.264 video. So that's actually pretty cool. That's a really fast frame rate for video. They're talking a lot about improved autofocus. And unfortunately, that's something we have to test hands-on. They have a lot more subject detection now, including cars and rally cars that they're separately specifying, motorcycles, aircraft, helicopters, bullet standard trains, and steam locomotives. 3 types of trains. Yes, Olympus has cornered the market for train spotters, as well as birds, dogs, and cats. The problem with this is that it is incredibly subjective. Every first and maybe second generation we see of new subject detection works absolutely terrible. But at some point, the manufacturers get enough years behind them, enough revs behind them, that these actually start to work properly. We're just now starting to see bird and dog and cat IAF work properly in the big cameras like Sony, Nikon, and Canon. But even then, it's hit or miss. It's kind of occasionally useful. In our previous test of Olympus cameras, when they were called that, they didn't come anywhere near keeping up with the capabilities of the Sony cameras. So they would have a lot of ground to cover if they were going to catch up to Sony. In our past tests with cameras like the EM-1X, the autofocusing and subject detection did not come anywhere close to matching Sony's technology at the time. And Sony has made some real leaps. So it would really take a miracle if these autofocus technologies were going to match the competition from Sony, Canon, and Nikon. But again, subscribe and we'll test it out. Here's the specs for the shutter. The mechanical shutter goes to 1/8,000th of a second, and the electronic shutter goes up to 1/32,000th of a second, something I never actually find myself using. Frames per second is a big benefit here since the sensor does seem to read out faster. They're going up to 10 frames per second using the mechanical shutter, 20 frames per second using the electronic shutter with continuous autofocus. That's up from 18 in the EM-1 Mark III. It also offers higher frames per second mode that I think do not support continuous autofocus and might not support auto exposure changing between the frames. At least that was the case on the EM-1X and EM-1 Mark III. The frame rates go all the way up to 120 frames per second now, matching the Z9. But the Z9 does it with pretty good autofocus, so it might not be comparable, but we'll have to test it to see when it comes out. And those electronic shutter modes all happen with no viewfinder blackout, something we've come to take for granted on the high-end mirrorless cameras. The buffering could be a real problem though. When you're shooting at 20 or 120 frames per second, the buffer will fill up. That's the amount of pictures that the camera can store temporarily while it slowly writes them out to the memory cards. The buffer will fill up in 108 RAW photos or 116 JPEG photos when shooting at 20 frames per second. That's not bad. That means you get almost 5.5 seconds of shooting when you're shooting RAW. That can be pretty good for things like sports and wildlife. You can still manage to fill that up. Trust me, you can shoot for a consecutive 5.5 seconds when you're waiting for the goalie to do that incredible dive. You're never quite sure when the instant's going to happen. You also have to wait for the entire buffer to clear for it to actually reset. So if you shoot in short bursts, it can accumulate, and pretty soon you run out of buffer and you start to miss the shot. A more serious problem happens when you shoot at 120 frames per second. Now it's buffering in only 92 frames, which means in that high frames per second, you do not even get a full 1 second of shooting, which means you need to be real careful when you press the shutter. You have to be able to perfectly anticipate that moment. To me, that means it's not going to be useful for things like field sports, because there's no way you're going to be able to time it within 1 second. It's going to be very challenging to catch the goal-winning kick when you only have 1 second to time it, and you have professional athletes literally trying to fool everybody on the field into thinking that they're not kicking it into the goal. But for more staged type of high-action sports like a skateboarder doing a kickflip, you could use that and be able to pull out a proper fully raw frame. That's something even the Nikon Z9 can't do. Here's the challenge. Those numbers are impressive, but will they actually work in the real world? In testing the EM-1X, we found the continuous autofocus to be completely insufficient for shooting sports. The frames per second was real until you started tracking moving subjects, and then had a hard time keeping them in focus, and the frames per second dropped drastically. So either it was dropping down to like 10 frames per second, or you were getting a bunch of out of focus shots, and it just made me feel like, oh, this isn't the camera I would ever recommend to somebody for sports. But we want to give it a fair shot. We don't want to base our assumptions on a camera that has not yet been released on our previous experiences. So I hope that they have improved it, but indeed, based on my previous experiences, they have a long way to go. Some other miscellaneous leaked specs: 2 SD cards, that's UHS 2. Kind of a disappointment. I wish they would upgrade it to the faster CF Express Type B cards. They're upgrading to 5 gigahertz Wi-Fi though. In testing other 5 gigahertz cameras, we find that the Wi-Fi performance still does not compare to something like a laptop or a smartphone running 5 gigahertz. The camera will have astro tracking, kind of like the Pentax cameras did, where they can track the stars moving across the sky using the sensor stabilization capability. That can eliminate star trails without having to use a tracking head separately, basically giving you cleaner images when you're doing astrophotography. And indeed, that should allow it to outperform similar full-frame cameras, so I'm excited to test that out. It'll have built-in GPS, which is unusual for cameras at this price point, allowing you to track your photos on a map after you take them, and they're increasing the sharpness significantly on both the rear screen and the electronic viewfinder. The rear screen is going up to 1.6 million dots, which is about, it's like 840 by 650. I don't know the exact resolution. So it's still a pretty low res screen. It's not going to compare to your smartphone, but it's a step in the right direction, and it's sharper than a lot of other higher end cameras. The electronic viewfinder is 5.76 million dots, which is a 1600 by 1200 display. So that should look really good and will be a huge step up for people currently shooting one of the Olympus cameras. We don't yet know the exact price, but 43rumors.com is reporting that it's going to be slightly above $2,000. The previous generation EM1 Mark III launched at $2,000 is now selling for about $1,500. So somewhere between $2,000 and $2,500 seems about right. OM Systems also leaked 2 new lenses, an update to the 12-40 f2.8 Pro and a new 40-150 f4 Pro. These are full-frame equivalents of a 24-80 f5.6 and an 80-300 f8 lens. And if you're boggled by how I'm applying the crop factor to the aperture, go to sdp.io/crop, and I have a ton of information about why that probably makes more sense to use the math like that. Now let's compare the new OM-1 to the EM1 Mark III. Of course, the OM-1 is more expensive, and it has a slightly higher frames per second with tracking autofocus, going from 18 to 20, but still not that big of a difference. However, if you give up the autofocus, you can jump to 120 frames per second. Previously, that was locked at 60 frames per second. I don't find that useful. I need autofocus for that kind of action. The video also doubles to 4K 60, and we are a 60 frames per second channel, so for me, that would actually be meaningful. The buffer is almost twice as big, going up to about 92 raw frames, up from 50, which is especially helpful if you want to shoot that 120 frames per second. And both the EVF and the rear screen will be much sharper, which really improves the experience of shooting, but not the final images. The price point above $2,000 really begs me to compare it to the Canon R6, which is a full frame camera, a sensor that's more than 4 times larger, with a complete set of Canon EF and RF lenses that we have found just amazing. They're similar in so many ways, and the price point is really similar. They're both about 20 megapixels. They both have 20 frames per second with AF tracking. The Canon R6 has a buffer for 180 raw frames, while the OM-1 has a lower buffer of only 108. But the OM-1 has a special mode that will lock AF and AE and shoot at 120 frames per second for a little bit less than a second. They both shoot video at 4K and 60 frames per second. That price difference means the OM-1 is going to have a lot to live up to if it's going to convince anybody to not upgrade to a full frame camera, but we'll take a look at a few more comparisons in a second. When we actually review this, I have a few questions that I need to answer about the OM-1. One specifically is eye autofocus accuracy, especially with fast telephoto portrait primes, because that's something that our last test on the EM1X really suffered at. It just was not good when you compare it against similarly priced full-frame cameras. I also need to test the continuous autofocus tracking with big telephotos. That was another really weak point of the EM1X. Another challenge I had with Olympus cameras was the electronic viewfinder lag. Didn't matter for landscapes, portraits, but for fast action sports, I found it much harder to track subjects in the viewfinder than newer full-frame cameras, something like the Canon R6, which has really minimal lag. And of course, we have to test rolling shutter, because when you're relying on that 20 frames per second silent shutter, you might introduce rolling shutter artifacts during fast pans. That can also mean you get flickering when shooting under artificial lights. And for scenarios where this could be useful, like indoor sports, they could be deal breakers. So we'll have to test that. Please hold out to see our review before you actually order it. Now, in perusing the new OM Systems website, I do see that they are continuing to use misunderstandings around crop factor to market their camera systems. You can see they still insist on comparing a 300mm f4 micro four thirds lens to a 600mm f4 full frame lens. But we know you would have to compare it to a 600mm f8 if you wanted to compare them by results rather than just numbers. This is like if a car manufacturer was bragging about having 2-second 0 to 60 times, but you found out it was 0 to 60 kilometers per hour instead of miles per hour. I can imagine the fanboys like, it doesn't matter kilometers or miles, what's the difference? What really matters is seconds, okay? 0 to 60 in seconds. You can forget the units. That's exactly what's happening here. Again, scp.io/crop will educate you more about that, but let's take that equivalence math into mind and compare the Micro Four Thirds systems versus full frame systems specifically for this wildlife scenario. Let's consider the Canon R6 attached to Canon's 800mm f11. That'll produce a similar angle of view, similar depth of field, and similar total light gathering capabilities. In other words, similar total visible noise as a Micro Four Thirds camera with their 300mm f4 lens and the 1.4 teleconverter. They both end up being equivalent to about 800mm f11. But the Canon R6 system is $3,500 total, whereas the Micro Four Thirds system is $5,250. That's right, Micro Four Thirds is more expensive, but it's also way heavier. This system ends up being 4.9 pounds, whereas the Canon system here is 4.3 pounds. And the Canon R6 autofocus is absolutely amazing. What if you're considering the OM Systems 150 to 400 f4.5? It is a built-in 1.2 teleconverter that'll bring it out to 500mm f6.6 physically, which is the full frame equivalent of 1000mm f13. In the Canon world, I could put on the 100 to 500 zoom, actually getting more zoom range, along with the 2x teleconverter. Now, the Canon R5 here is producing full frame results of 200 to 1000 at f14, basically identical. The weight, indeed, is almost exactly the same as the Micro Four Thirds system would be, except that this is $2,100 cheaper. And this has 45 megapixels instead of 20 megapixels. And if you're a wildlife photographer, trust me, it is really nice to have a high megapixel count allowing you to crop more deeply. Having spent a lot of time shooting with both systems, there's no way I could recommend to a new buyer to choose the Micro Four Thirds system over the full frame system that's less expensive and more capable. But if I were spending $9,500, I'd probably steer somebody to the amazing Sony A1, which shoots 30 frames per second raw, 50 megapixels, and has the best autofocus tracking system we've ever seen. Absolutely astounding for wildlife. I personally shoot it with Sony's 600 f4 and a 1.4x teleconverter, but if you wanted an equivalent to the OM Systems 150 to 400, you'd probably use the Sony 200 to 600 and a 1.4x teleconverter. That extra reach you could get by cropping because the pixel density on the A1 is so high. And you're still $450 cheaper, and you have the world's greatest wildlife camera. In the comments down below, I want to hear, is Olympus back? Is this the wow camera that you've been hoping for, or is it manufacturer clickbait? Are you willing to pay this price, or are you ready to move on to a different system? Whatever the answer, subscribe to see the full review, and of course, check out our sponsor, Squarespace. They make amazing websites, far superior to your presence on social media. With a Squarespace website, you can set up a proper store with no restrictions. You can take appointments from clients. You can sell your prints. You can really show off your work without bombarding potential viewers with a bunch of social media ads. You need your own domain, so you have a real email address with your last name or the name of your business instead of gmail.com, right? Right now, head to squarespace.com/Tony, drag your pictures in, see what it's like to actually set it up. And if you love it after your trial, use the coupon code Tony and you'll get 10% off. Thanks, Squarespace. Don't forget to subscribe. Bye.